The night the talks collapsed in Geneva, Iranian ballistic missiles were already airborne. Not metaphorically, not as a warning shot fired into empty desert, but real, armed, and tracking toward Israeli military installations in the Negev. The world had roughly 11 minutes to decide what came next, and nobody in any capital on earth was ready for that decision. Let's go back to the beginning, because this didn't start with a missile launch. It started with a handshake that never happened. The Swiss city of Montreux had been chosen carefully neutral ground, far from the smoke of the Middle East, a place where diplomats could pretend that geography and history didn't matter for a few days. The fifth round of indirect nuclear negotiations between Iran and the United States, brokered by European intermediaries, had been scheduled for 3 days of intensive talks. Iran's chief negotiator arrived. The American delegation arrived. And then, on the second morning, something went wrong behind closed doors that nobody has fully explained to the public yet. Within 6 hours, the Iranian delegation had packed their bags. The American team issued a statement calling the collapse deeply regrettable. Iran called it a deliberate sabotage. And by the time the sun set over Lake Geneva, the diplomatic architecture that had been holding this particular powder keg together for the better part of 2 years was gone. Here is what makes that moment so critical to understand: the Montreux talks weren't just about uranium enrichment percentages and inspection schedules. They were the last functional channel of communication between Tehran and Washington on the question of whether Iran's nuclear program would cross the threshold that Israeli military planners had defined, years earlier, as their absolute red line. When those talks died, so did the assumption that there was still time. Meanwhile, 600 miles to the southeast, Israeli Merkava 4 tanks were rolling through southern Lebanese villages that, under the ceasefire agreement brokered the previous November, they were supposed to have vacated weeks earlier. The Israeli Defense Forces had publicly acknowledged the delay, framing it as a security necessity. There were weapons caches, they said, tunnel networks that hadn't been fully mapped, Hezbollah infrastructure that posed an immediate threat. The Lebanese government protested. The United Nations interim force in Lebanon filed formal complaints. France, which had co-brokered the ceasefire, issued increasingly sharp statements. None of it moved a single tank. For the people living in those border villages, Lebanese families who had returned to find their homes damaged, their olive groves torn up by tank treads, their neighbors still displaced, the agreement that was supposed to end their nightmare had become a piece of paper that apparently meant nothing. And for Hezbollah's military leadership, watching Israeli armor expand its footprint day by day, the ceasefire was transforming from a pause in fighting into something that looked, from their perspective, like a permanent occupation being established 1 kilometer at a time. Think about that for a moment from any perspective you choose: Israeli, Lebanese, Iranian, American. When agreements get violated openly, when the party doing the violating faces no meaningful consequence, what signal does that send to every other actor in the region about what agreements are actually worth? The first Iranian strike came 9 days after the Montreux collapse. 14 Fateh-110 ballistic missiles were launched from positions in western Iran, targeting the Negev air base in the Negev desert, the same base that houses Israel's F-35 Ayadir fleet. Israel's Arrow 3 interceptor system, designed specifically for ballistic threats at high altitude, engaged immediately. The Iron Dome batteries around the base went active. In the end, 9 of the 14 missiles were intercepted. The remaining 5 struck within the base perimeter. 2 aircraft hangars were damaged. A fuel depot caught fire that burned for 11 hours. 3 Israeli Air Force personnel were killed, and 17 were wounded. 3 people. 17 wounded. In the calculus of modern warfare, those numbers might seem almost manageable. But in the calculus of Israeli strategic doctrine, a doctrine built on the absolute principle that no attack on Israeli soil goes unanswered, and that any precedent of absorbing a strike without response invites the next, larger strike, those 3 deaths were not a manageable data point. They were a trigger. The Israeli War Cabinet convened within the hour. The meeting lasted through the night. American officials, reached by secure line from the Situation Room, urged restraint and a measured response. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, already operating in the eastern Mediterranean, was repositioned not toward the Israeli coast, but into a holding pattern that gave it options in multiple directions. That repositioning was itself a message, though exactly to whom and saying exactly what depended on who was reading it. Now here is the question that keeps military analysts up at night, and it's worth sitting with honestly. If you were in that Israeli war cabinet, facing a strike that killed your people, violated your airspace, and was launched by a country whose leadership has publicly stated it does not recognize your right to exist, do you strike back immediately and risk full escalation? Or do you absorb the hit and try to preserve some remaining diplomatic channel? There's no clean answer. Both choices carry catastrophic risk. Both choices have defenders with serious arguments. That's what makes this moment so genuinely terrifying. Israel's response came 48 hours later, and it was not measured in the way Washington had hoped. A package of F-35I Adirs and F-15I Rams, the Adir being Israel's most advanced stealth platform, the Ram its long-range strike workhorse, crossed into Iranian airspace via a northern corridor over Iraqi territory, with apparent coordination or at least non-interference from certain regional actors whose names have not been officially confirmed. The targets were the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, buried deep under a mountain near Qom, and the Natan centrifuge facility, which had been partially rebuilt after previous strikes years earlier. The Fordow strike used bunker-penetrating munitions. The Natan's attack combined air-delivered bombs with what Israeli sources later described as simultaneous cyber disruption of the facility's control systems. The damage at Natan's was significant. The damage at Fordow was assessed as severe but not total. The mountain above the facility absorbed much of the impact, and Iranian engineers had built redundancy into the deepest levels specifically because they had anticipated this scenario. Iran's Qord had 15 air defense systems, the domestically produced medium-range interceptors that Tehran had been deploying around its nuclear sites, managed to engage several of the attacking aircraft. One F-15I Ram was hit by missile fire over central Iran. The pilot ejected. The circumstances of what happened next, whether the pilot was recovered, by whom, and in what condition, became one of the most sensitive and tightly controlled pieces of information in the entire crisis. Iran's S-300 batteries, positioned around Tehran and the major nuclear sites, were partially suppressed by Israeli electronic warfare, but not entirely. The air battle over central Iran lasted approximately 40 minutes of active engagement. 3 Israeli aircraft were confirmed damaged. The pilot situation remained classified. In Tehran, the response to the Israeli strike was not panic, it was fury, organized and purposeful. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated assets that had been pre-positioned for exactly this scenario. From launch sites in multiple Iranian provinces, Zulfikar medium-range ballistic missiles were fired in a second wave, this time targeting not just military infrastructure but also the port of Haifa and the northern Israeli city's industrial zone. The Zulfikar carries a larger warhead than the Fateh 110 and has greater range. 22 missiles were launched. Israeli Arrow 3 and David Sling batteries intercepted 16. 6 reached their targets. The Haifa port area sustained serious damage to a fuel storage facility. A residential neighborhood in the city's northern suburbs was struck. The civilian casualty count from that strike alone was 23 dead and over 80 wounded. Those 23 civilians in Haifa, that number changed everything about the political atmosphere inside Israel. Military casualties can be contained within a strategic framework. Civilian deaths in a port city, in apartment buildings, in a neighborhood where people were simply trying to live their lives, those deaths produce a different kind of pressure. The Israeli public, which had been divided on how aggressively to respond to Iran, shifted. The political space for restraint narrowed dramatically. While the air war was developing, the maritime dimension of the crisis was escalating in ways that threatened the global economy directly. Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval forces, operating fast attack craft and coordinating with what appeared to be submarine assets, including vessels from Iran's Ghadar-class submarine fleet, small but capable of operating in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, began a campaign of harassment and interdiction in the Strait of Hormuz. 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through that strait. When Iranian forces boarded and briefly seized a Panamanian-flagged tanker on the third day of the crisis, oil prices spiked 18% in a single trading session. The USS Gerald R. Ford and its strike group moved south from the eastern Mediterranean toward the Red Sea approaches, a repositioning that was simultaneously a show of force and a logistical preparation for expanded operations if ordered. Israeli Dolphin-class submarines, nuclear-capable according to widely accepted but officially unconfirmed assessments, moved to undisclosed positions in the eastern Mediterranean. Israeli Sa-AR-6 corvettes, equipped with the Sea Dome naval version of Iron Dome, took up defensive positions off the Israeli coast. The world was watching all of this in real time, and the reactions from major powers were telling precisely because of how carefully calibrated they were. The United States condemned the Iranian missile strikes on Israel unambiguously and reiterated its commitment to Israeli security. It also, in the same statement, called for immediate de-escalation and a return to diplomatic channels, language that satisfied nobody fully and was read by Tehran as evidence that Washington would not actually intervene militarily, and was read by Tel Aviv as insufficient backing for the scale of response Israel's government believed was necessary. Russia issued a statement calling for restraint from all parties, a formulation that deliberately placed Israel and Iran on equivalent moral footing, which Israeli officials found infuriating and which served Moscow's interest in appearing as a neutral mediator while actually having no intention of constraining Iran, with whom Russia had been deepening military and economic cooperation throughout the preceding years. Vladimir Putin reportedly spoke with Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei by phone during the crisis. The content of that conversation was not disclosed. What was disclosed, through Russian state media, was that Putin had expressed understanding of Iran's security concerns. Xi Jinping's China was more cautious in its public statements but more active in private diplomacy, according to multiple diplomatic sources. China imports enormous quantities of Iranian oil and has significant economic interests in regional stability. Chinese diplomatic channels were reportedly being used to pass messages between Tehran and Washington during the period when direct communication had essentially broken down. Whether those channels were being used to genuinely seek de-escalation or to gather intelligence and position China advantageously for the aftermath, that question has no clean answer, and it's worth asking yourself what you think China's actual incentive structure looks like in this scenario. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, found themselves in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. They had normalized or were normalizing relations with Israel. They feared Iranian power projection. They also had populations that were deeply sympathetic to Palestinian and Lebanese civilians caught in the crossfire, and they had their own economic infrastructure sitting within range of Iranian missiles. Saudi Arabia and the UAE quietly communicated to both Washington and Tehran that they would not permit their territory to be used for military operations against Iran, and they urged all parties to step back. Qatar, which hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East, found itself simultaneously trying to maintain its relationship with Washington and its function as a backchannel to Hamas and Iran. The UN Security Council convened in emergency session. The resulting statement was blocked by Russian and Chinese vetoes on any language that specifically condemned Iran's initial missile strike, and was blocked by the American veto on any language that specifically condemned the Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. The Council issued no statement at all. The institution designed to manage exactly this kind of crisis produced silence. On the ground in southern Lebanon, the situation had deteriorated into active combat. Hezbollah, which had been observing a fragile ceasefire while watching the Israeli tanks refuse to withdraw, made its decision. Rocket fire from southern Lebanon into northern Israel resumed, not at the scale of the 2024 conflict, but enough to force evacuations in Kiryat Shmona and several smaller northern communities. Israeli Merkava 4 tanks, already in position, responded with artillery. The Lebanese villages of Bint Jbeil and Marjiyun, which had been trying to return to something like normal life, found themselves once again in the middle of a war that the people living there had never voted for and could not escape. The human geography of this conflict is something that gets lost in the strategic analysis, and it deserves a moment. In Haifa, a woman named, and we'll call her Sarah, because her family has asked for privacy, had lived in the same apartment for 30 years. She survived previous wars, previous rocket attacks, previous moments when the sirens sent her to the shelter. She survived this one too, physically. Her neighbor did not. In Tehran, families in the neighborhoods near the Revolutionary Guard installations that Israel had struck in a follow-on attack were dealing with the consequences of being near military infrastructure in a city of 9 million people who had no say in their government's nuclear program or its missile launches. In southern Lebanon, a family that had returned to their village 3 weeks earlier, after months of displacement, was packing their car again. The cost of strategic decisions is paid in these specific, individual lives. That's not a sentiment, it's a fact that gets obscured when we talk about missile counts and intercept rates and damage assessments. By the end of the first week of active exchanges, the casualty figures were roughly as follows: Israel had suffered 31 military dead, 23 civilian dead, and over 200 wounded of various severity. Iran had suffered an estimated 40 military dead from the Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities and related infrastructure, with civilian casualties in adjacent areas estimated at between 15 and 35, the uncertainty reflecting the difficulty of obtaining reliable information from inside Iran. Lebanon had suffered approximately 60 dead, the majority civilian, from the renewed fighting in the south. These numbers are not large by the standards of major wars. They are enormous by the standards of human beings who had names and families and plans for next week. The question of who is responsible for the collapse of the Montreux talks, and therefore, in some causal chain, for everything that followed, is one that will be debated for years. Iranian officials have pointed to what they describe as last-minute American demands that went beyond the agreed negotiating framework, demands they characterize as a deliberate poison pill inserted to give Israel grounds to launch its strikes. American officials have pointed to Iranian refusal to agree to enhanced inspection protocols that were, from Washington's perspective, the minimum necessary to make any agreement credible. Israeli intelligence officials, speaking anonymously to several news organizations, have suggested that Iran was never negotiating in good faith at Montreux, that the talks were cover for completing a specific technical milestone in the enrichment program. And there are analysts who point to a third possibility, that external actors with interests in preventing any Iran-US rapprochement were working behind the scenes to ensure the talks failed. Who those actors might be, and what their methods were, remains genuinely contested and genuinely important. Tana samum deli vinavat Iran, Israel, ili tretya sila? That question, translated, who was actually to blame, Iran, Israel, or a third party? It's not rhetorical. The answer shapes everything about what comes next, including whether any future negotiation is even possible. The second Iranian missile wave, which came on day 9 of the crisis, introduced the element that changed the military calculus most dramatically. Among the missiles launched were what Iranian state media identified as Fateh hypersonic missiles, Iran's claimed hypersonic glide vehicle, which if performing as advertised would travel at speeds that make interception by existing systems extremely difficult. The Israeli defense establishment had been tracking Iran's hypersonic program with deep concern for years. Now those concerns were no longer theoretical. Of the Fateh missiles launched in this wave, Israeli officials confirmed that their intercept systems had struggled. 2 of the 4 Fateh missiles launched reached their targets, one striking a radar installation in the Negev, one impacting near an airbase in central Israel with damage that the IDF described as significant but not critical. The penetration of Israeli missile defense by a hypersonic weapon, even partially, even in limited numbers, sent a message that reverberated through every defense ministry in the world. The logic of missile defense as a strategic stabilizer, the logic that had justified Israel's investment in Arrow 3 and David's Sling, was being tested in real time. And the test results were uncomfortable. In Washington, the debate inside the administration had shifted. The question was no longer whether to urge restraint, that ship had sailed. The question was whether American forces would become directly involved if Israel decided to launch a comprehensive strike designed to permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear capability and degrade its missile forces. The USS Gerald R. Ford was in position. American F-22s and B-2 bombers at regional bases were on elevated alert status. The decision about whether to cross from support to direct participation was sitting on a desk somewhere, and the person behind the desk was facing the same impossible choice that every decision-maker in this crisis had faced: act, and risk making it worse; don't act, and risk making it worse in a different way. How would you make that call? Seriously, not as a thought experiment, but as a genuine question about what values and what calculations you'd bring to it. Because the people making these decisions are not supervillains or heroes. They're people with incomplete information, enormous pressure, and consequences that extend far beyond anything they can fully model. The diplomatic effort to halt the cycle was not dead, even at this point. Qatar was shuttling messages. The Swiss Foreign Ministry, despite the collapse of the Montreux talks, was offering its facilities for emergency contact. A senior Chinese diplomat arrived in Tehran. A French envoy flew to Tel Aviv. The machinery of diplomacy was grinding, slowly, against the momentum of military action. Whether that machinery would produce anything before the next strike, Israeli, Iranian, or potentially American, was the question that hung over every conversation, every intelligence assessment, every sleepless night in every relevant capital. There is a particular kind of dread that people who lived through the Cold War describe when they talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the sense that events had developed their own momentum, that the humans nominally in control were actually running to keep up with a machine they had set in motion but could no longer easily stop. People who were watching the Iran-Israel crisis in real time described something similar. Not identical, the nuclear arsenals involved were different in scale, the alliance structures were different, the information environment was completely different. But the feeling of watching a sequence of actions and reactions that each seemed logical from the perspective of the actor taking them, while the aggregate trajectory was toward catastrophe, that feeling was recognizable. The Shahids were still flying. The Fatah missiles were still being prepared on their launchers. The F-35 Ayadirs were still on alert. The Ghadar submarines were still in the Gulf. The Dolphin submarines were still at undisclosed positions. The Gerald R. Ford was still holding, waiting for orders that might or might not come. And somewhere in all of this, in the rubble of a hangar at Nevadim, in the burned fuel depot, in the apartment building in Haifa, in the villages of southern Lebanon, in the neighborhoods near the centrifuge halls at Natanz, were people who had not chosen any of this and could not stop any of it. The next move belongs to someone. It always does. The question is whether that someone, whoever they are, in whatever room they're sitting in right now, will find a way to be the person who stopped the sequence rather than extended it. Because here's the thing about escalation ladders, every rung looks like the last necessary one from the bottom. It's only from the top that you can see how far there is to fall. The strike, the next one, whichever side launches it, may already be in the air. Or it may be sitting in a decision memo on a desk, one signature away from becoming real. Or it may be the one that doesn't happen, because someone in a room somewhere found a different option that the models hadn't predicted. Which of those three endings do you think is most likely? And more importantly, which one do you think is still possible to choose?